hatred. And we'll come back to some of these images that are on the screen a little later on. But I want to start, and you don't have to read this. This is just an enumeration of 7 different incidents that had taken place around the world since Hanukkah. That is, since the middle of December. And these have been cataloged. The ADL, Anti-Defamation League, really keeps sadly, a growing list of episodes or incidents from the Anne Frank Memorial in Boise, Idaho, which was vandalized with swastikas and neo-Nazi symbols, to lots of menorahs all around the country, in Iowa, Massachusetts, and California, and here in New England, right outside of Dartmouth. But in Belgium, there was a whole situation, in Florida, in Wisconsin, in France. And so it's there. It's, as we all know, unfortunately, it's alive and growing. In fact, it's growing to this. Here we have an ad that appeared in Georgia just a couple of weeks ago, saying Schumer spending $3 million in Georgia for John Ossoff. Democrats are trying to buy Georgia. Well, is it really Democrats that are trying to buy Georgia, or Schumer, who is now the first Jewish majority leader in the Senate? But I think the interesting thing is the depiction of 33-year-old John Ossoff. I want you to take a look at his nose, because the reality is that's his nose. And what they did in this poster using Photoshop is they attempted to enlarge the nose to make it much more of that stereotypical caricature of a Jew with large nose. And of course, the idea that they're spending money, we'll come back to that later on, that stereotype regarding Jews and money and the use of money as part of a worldwide conspiracy that the Jews are trying to financially take over the world. These are themes, anti-Semitic themes, and they very somewhat subtly or not subtly manifested themselves in the most recent campaign in Georgia. Now, as Jews, we take great pride that, yes, Ossoff is a young Jewish man, and he adds to the number of Jews in our Congress, which, by the way, I numerically counted it, very disproportionate number, both in the Senate and the House, to the total number of Jews in the United States, which factor in under 2%. We have more than 2% in both Congress, in Congress, and that says something. I don't want to feed into the anti-Semitism, but that's kind of where it comes from. So let's start with the word anti-Semitism, which is very simply defined as prejudice against or hatred of Jews. But what's very fascinating is the word anti-Semitism itself does not appear anywhere in print until 1879, when a fairly minor nationalistic German writer by the name of Wilhelm Marr, in an anti-Jewish pamphlet, uses the word anti-Semitism as a way of advancing the view that Jews constituted a distinct racial group, and we'll come back to that chronologically when we get to the 19th century, a racial group which was both physically and morally inferior. And he did this in the context of accusing wealthy Jews of trying to dominate Germany economically. Up to that point, the word anti-Semitism doesn't exist, although we will use it going way back in ancient times because it's just easier to say it that way. The question you might ask is, why am I spelling it without the hyphen? And that's been an interesting thing, because if you pick up the New York Times or the Washington Post or on CNN, it's always spelled A-N-T-I hyphen capital S-E-M-I-T-I-S-M. But the Holocaust Museum and Facing History and other prominent Jewish organizations are moving away from the use of the anti with the hyphen, because what it does is it legitimizes some kind of pseudoscientific racial classification of Semitism. Because the truth of the matter is, Semitism doesn't really exist as a word. we do have people who speak Semitic languages. It's a linguistic classification. So the largest spoken Semitic language is Arabic, and then there's Hebrew, and there's Amharic, which is a language of Ethiopia. And all those people who speak these Semitic languages might be classified as Semites. So if you put anti in front of it with a capital S, it would imply that you're against people who speak these languages. I don't think anyone would identify being anti-Semitic as being anti-people who speak Arabic, unless they happen to be Israelis or other Jews who speak Arabic. But so since its inception, the word has always meant prejudice exclusively against Jews. It's believed today linguistically that it's probably better to simply write it as a single word, lowercase, with no hyphen. And if you look at other languages, if you look at French, Spanish, German, although all nouns in German are capitalized, it's always one word. Antisemitismus is what it is in German or in French or in Italian. So we're going to use it throughout this presentation, and it's interesting to see, are we going to reach that point in time where the media are going to also begin to shift over to the linguistic word with one word? All right. Other thing we need to look at is, how is anti-Semitism different from other types of hatred or prejudice? And this is a very lengthy conversation that we're not going to get into, because it really comes down to what exactly is a Jew. And the reason why I say that is that you have Judaism is both a religion, obviously, but also has taken on another layer of a certain degree of ethnicity. So we have people that we know they see themselves as ethnic, non-religious Jews. And so there's that ethnic category, and then there's Judaism being clearly a religion. And so when we talk about anti-Semitism, it gets blurred, because it's obviously against a group of people, whether they're practicing in religious or not. And we'll see where that factors in way later in our story when we get to the period of Nazism. Because to the Nazis, there was no differentiation. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. And even if you had converted from the religious Judaism, that does not mean you weren't a Jew. And therefore, we'll see how that factors in a little briefly. By the way, we're not going to spend an extensive amount of time on the Holocaust, but I want to bring it up to that point, particularly since, as was pointed out, in a couple of weeks, we're going to be at International Holocaust Remembrance, which is January 27th, which marks the liberation of Auschwitz. And I say international because, except for Israel and the United States, around the world, it's January 27th where we do the commemoration of the Holocaust. In the United States, we follow the Israeli designation being in the spring. Yom HaShoah is always in the spring. So you may always wonder why there are two. That's why. All right. Also, just to set this up, although we're going to go chronologically, I'm going to look at this using 4 different historical routes. We're going to see the interplay of religious, economics, political, and racial as this is defined as we go forward. This particular illustration, just to skip ahead, is the Spanish version of a very important anti-Semitic work called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is what it is in Spanish. And again, there's a universality, unfortunately, to anti-Semitism. It has no political boundaries. And so we're going to see how that factors in as well. So let's start at the so-called very beginning. We're going to look at the earliest form of anti-Semitism, which was anti-Judaism. And just as a starting point, we'll go into the Roman Empire, because there are many examples of, quote, anti-Semitism going way back, even earlier than Rome, but it's a logical starting point. In the pre-Christian Roman Empire, the Jews that lived in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, in the Eastern Mediterranean, were denigrated, put down for basically their monotheistic practice, the refusal to adopt Roman gods and religious practices, their dietary laws, refusal to intermarry, their observance of the Sabbath, and most importantly, the practice of circumcision. And I say most importantly because that is going to be, in many respects, in my opinion, the physical hallmark of being Jewish, because it becomes a distinguishing mark for Jewish men And in that time, it were only the Jews who circumcised. That will then change with the advent of Islam in the 7th century, because Islam also practices circumcision, but back in Roman times that didn't exist. And it continues all the way forward, because when you think about what happened in the Holocaust, many good, righteous Gentiles desirous of helping their Jewish neighbors were reluctant to hide and rescue Jewish boys. Because if anything happened and that boy was ever seen as naked, right away they would notice that he was circumcised. And so that becomes very, very interesting. And if you want to watch a very fascinating, entertaining, but serious film at the same time regarding this, that factors very prominent in the Holocaust, is a European film, Europa, where we have a Jewish male who is literally hidden in plain sight, and what he has to go through in order to make sure that no one ever sees him without clothes. And so that's very important that we don't think about, because in more modern times, the practice of circumcision became more universal, although there's still a lot of medical debate on this, and there are actually parts of Europe where they have not allowed circumcision now, except for religious purposes. So that goes way back as part of that covenant between Jews and God, the idea of the practice of circumcision. And so that becomes, we might see that as a little something that distinguishes Jews from non-Jews in the ancient world. Well, we get to the period of Christianity. We know that Jesus was born and died a Jew. He was a Jew from Galilee and the northern part of the Judea province. We also know that there's no evidence that neither Jesus nor any of his immediate followers left any written records. It's only in the period following Jesus's death, which is approximately in 30 CE, that we have a small movement growing up around his oral teachings. And we just put it into the historical context. There were many, many Jewish sects in the 1st century. And so one of those Jewish sects were those people who were kind of revolving around Jesus's teachings. We know from what we can piece together that he was a kind of, what I call him, an itinerant rabbi, because remember, rabbi in those days was not an ordained clergyman. There were the priests in the temple. Rabbis were just teachers, and they could go around and they had followers. And so we know that that was clearly what happened with Jesus, but it was only following his death that things begin to coalesce a little bit more. We know that in 70 CE, the Romans destroy the major temple in Jerusalem, and that creates the period of what we know down the road as the Jewish diaspora, where Jews begin to leave the hub of Judaism in Jerusalem and begin to go into, as this map points out, the area of what is today Iran or Persia, up into the Mediterranean, following the roads of the Roman Empire, and they begin to move into areas of the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. The followers of Jesus who remained in Judea, they begin more and more to differentiate themselves from their fellow Jews. And we begin to see what we might regard as a coalescence of an actual new religion, clearly not something that Jesus had in mind. Much of our knowledge of this comes from the Christian scriptures referred to by Christians as the New Testament. And the New Testament, we know, religious scholars have told us, is a collection of documents written in the generations after Jesus's death, probably in the period of 70 or 80 CE. And from what we can ascertain, was completed about 130 years after Jesus's death. What we all, and I'm not a religious scholar, but what I've picked up is that the writers of the New Testament, as these different books are added on, we begin to see a different attitude about the relationship between Jews and these early followers. They're almost having an internal debate with one another. And many of the writers, particularly in the latter chapters, begin to express more and more anger toward their fellow Jews who did not believe in the divinity of Jesus, that Jesus was not the Messiah. And this now fosters this notion, and there are lines in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Matthew, that we begin to see the Jews being blamed exclusively for the death of Jesus. And in Christian practice, if Jesus is regarded as God, we give birth to that notion of deicide, the killing of God. And that becomes the basis, the religious basis of the earliest form of anti-Semitism as we move into the Christian world. So it started out very differently in the pre-Christian world. With the creation and the growth of Christianity, we now have this religious foundation based on the writings that appear in the New Testament. By the 4th century in 330, Christianity becomes a privileged religion under the Emperor Constantine, who now sees the Jews as disloyal subjects. And by the end of that century, Theodosius I will now make Christianity the empire's official religion. And from this point forward, Christianity gains and Christians gain power over the Jews. Now, I should point out that what helps the spread of this little religion is the incredible sophisticated infrastructure of the Roman Empire, with roads that allow disciples, so to speak, to travel. The other thing that happens is that there is a point in time when you no longer have to be a Jew to then be a Christian. It's kind of liberated from that initial criteria, because we know that all the original Christians were Jews. Once that's no longer kind of a prerequisite, then we begin to see the spread of the religion. So by the time we get to the collapse of the Roman Empire in Western Europe in 476, as Europe collapses and we have the development of what we know as a very decentralized feudal system, Christianity will become the unifying force with a very complex hierarchical church organization. So when there's an absence of political unity, the church now is going to fill in those voids. And as the church fills in the voids, Christianity now grows in its importance, and religious anti-Semitism now begins to take root in the form of restrictive laws, forced conversions, all kinds of false accusations, and violence. And that is going to dominate Christian-Jewish relations well into the 20th century. I want to point out this pair of statues. They're, by the way, not in proportion. In reality, they are the same size, but the images I got shows the one on the right a little larger than the one on the left, but they should be the same size. These two figures are known as ecclesia on the left and synagoga on the right, and they are very prominent in many Gothic cathedrals in Europe. That means they come from the 12th to the 13th centuries. These two happen to be out of the cathedral in Strasbourg in France. There were very notable ones that were rescued with the burning of Notre Dame in Paris a couple of years ago. But remember, in the Middle Ages, the majority of people were totally ignorant. They couldn't read and write. They would come into this awesome place called the church, very overwhelming architecturally, and they would listen to a sermon in a language they had absolutely no idea. They did not understand Latin. They spoke vernacular languages, and the whole church service until much later on was only conducted in Latin. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, and yet what they could do is they could visually get their understanding of the religion through the statuary and the stained glass windows that appeared in these churches. So you're walking into the church and you now see these two figures on statues pretty much near the entrance in most churches. And on the left, you see ecclesia. There she is with a nice, pleasant expression on her face. In her left hand, she has a chalice. And on the right hand, she has a staff with a crucifix at the top. Very welcoming, very pleasant. She's seen the light. Now, look at the figure on her right. Synagoga. I don't know if there's anything important about the fact that in this depiction, she's with a horizontally striped garment. That's not always the case, but her crown is on, but it's a little bit to the skewed. Sometimes the crown of synagogue is at her feet, but there's no question there's a broken staff, even though it looks like a baseball bat, a broken staff in her right hand. The word of the Bible, the Torah, is slipping out of her hands in left, but most importantly, she's blindfolded. To a peasant looking at this, she no longer sees the light. Judaism is no longer the favored religion. Christianity has clearly taken precedence. And so now you walk into the church and there it is, right there in your face. And we begin to see these definite iconic images of anti-Semitism unfolding in the early Middle Ages, particularly in regarding to churches. And this is what we would call anti-Judaism. The church issues all kinds of restrictions. And so in the 13th century, in the year 1215, we have a council, the Lateran Council, and in it, we have a very important statement. We decree that such Jews of both sexes in every Christian province and at all times should be marked off in the eyes of the public from other peoples through the character of their dress. Now, I do want to put this into a historic context because in the Middle Ages, what you wore reflected who you were, because this is the time of the guild system. So the Baker's Guild, for example, was distinguished by the large white hat, the toque that we associate with bakers and chefs. So if you walk down the street in a medieval town, you would say, oh, he's a baker. So to see the Jew, it wasn't like they were the only ones wearing symbols. And we see in this some different things. On the right, and it's a little bit also on the left, you see this hat, conical shaped hat with a little ball on the top. That was the Jew, and they have variations, and it doesn't matter where it is. In Europe, that was there. The other thing that was very prominent, you see them in the couple in the middle, is the circle, the gold circle with the hole in the middle. And that, of course, reflected a coin, because we'll see the Jews become associated very early in the Middle Ages with money. And so you would see this, and we'll see this coming up in other images later on. That was a sign of being Jewish. I say this, and when I do this with kids, I always point out to them, where do you see this later on in the Nazi period, the affixing of the yellow star? I always say to kids, Hitler was a plagiarist, didn't give his citations. The idea of Jews wearing distinguished images goes back to the Middle Ages. It didn't start with the Nazi period. Jews had to distinguish themselves in the eyes of the public through the character of their dress. And we'll see that later on. Likewise, the part of these decrees very often required Jews to live separately from their Christian neighbors in a Jewish part of town or a Jewish quarter. These are actual street signs from Europe today. So the original ghetto, for example, seen in the left, it was in the city of Venice. All kinds of interesting controversy or uncertainty of the origin of the word. It is believed to come from the Italian word geta, which means an iron factory. And the Italian suffix "to" is a place name, as in a place like the Italian city of Sorrento or Orvieto. So this was the ghetto. Others believe that instead of the word ghetto, geta meaning Italian, that it comes from the Hebrew word get, which means a separation, as in when you secure a divorce in Israel, and Judaism, you get a get. So it is a place of separation. Avi Ivan, the Israeli diplomat and historian, he felt that was the origin. We don't know for certain, but we do know that the first ghetto was in Italy. And we know that the word ghetto over time will take on different meaning. Connotation later on is an area that's run down and broken, only because it very often became an area of being kind of disheveled. But in the beginning, it was simply the area. But then you have others. Up on the top right is the Calle de la Juderia Vieja. That is from today from Cordova. That was the section of the city where the Jews were ultimately expelled in 1492 under Ferdinand and Isabella, which we'll get to. In German towns, you'll have Judengasse or Judenstrasse. In France, it's the Rue de Juif. These are all actual signs today. And what's fascinating is you can go into a German city today and you could be on Judenstrasse, which was where the Jews lived. And so people live on Judenstrasse, and that's the name of the street. Can you imagine having a street in any place in the United States called Jewish Street? Now, that's not to say we don't have parts of towns that people pejoratively, anti-Semitically refer to as the Jew area, Jew town, and we know that's true. But in Europe, there's nothing wrong with having an area known as Judenstrasse or Judenplatz. It's just historically where the Jews of that town lived. But it all goes back to the Middle Ages, that idea of compulsory segregation. Jews should not interact with non-Jews. Jews were not allowed to hire non-Jews, and non-Jews were not supposed to hire Jews. And so in terms of hiring someone to do work for you, the idea was not to have that kind of interaction. And certainly when it came to sexual interaction, that was absolutely to be forbidden as well. Jews also begin to see that economic aspect, because the Jews need to do something. The church prohibited usury. That is the taking of charging interest for lending money. By the way, so too does Jewish law, derived from Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and Jewish practice is you're not supposed to take advantage of those less fortunate. Although in Judaism it was, if you want to take advantage, without saying so, of others, you could. But Jews become very pragmatic. Under the feudal system, the manorial system, they couldn't own land. They couldn't be members of craft guilds. So that limited their professions. They could be traveling merchants or peddlers. So you get that idea of the Jew who is out there peddling things because the people need things that they couldn't buy on their own, or they couldn't create on their own. And because there was a network going back through Europe, back to the Holy Land, they could bring goods, luxury goods in particular. Jews could be jewelers. In Venice, the entire glass blowing industry was completely dominated by the Jews. So they begin to take on that role, but also they begin to fill a very important role of lending money to the church, to kings, to princes, and other wealthy Christians. They very often serve as the tax collectors. So think about it. Do you like the person you owe money to? Do you like the person who's coming around getting taxes? Jews become very closely associated with money. They become very closely associated with being greedy. Again, it's a pragmatism. Up in the top right, this is a Spanish drawing. You can see the Jew identified by the conical hat. But also, very interestingly, if you look closely at the noses of the Jewish banker, we begin to see the notation that the Jew has a large nose. No one can definitely pinpoint why that happened. It may very well be that this particular Jewish man had a large nose, but that becomes part of that stereotypical caricature of the Jew with a large nose. And yet there's nothing written anywhere that describes why. It becomes part of the iconology of anti-Semitism that will persist, as I pointed out, looking at the ad to not vote for Osef in Georgia. All right, then, of course, in the Middle Ages, we have that penultimate expression of Catholic or Christian fervor, the Crusades. In the 11th century, Pope Urban II calls for the liberation of Jerusalem, which has been taken over by Islamic Turks. Crusaders are going to go off to free the Holy Land from the infidel Turks. But on their way, they're going to come upon Jewish communities that are in Europe, particularly in the Rhineland, which is today what would be parts of the Netherlands and Germany. And they begin to get very anxious and very overzealous, and they start forcing Jews in these areas to convert, and they begin to massacre in what we might in some cases regard to as kind of very early pogroms. We begin to attack, and we have some eyewitnesses down on the bottom slide. We have a witness, Albert of Aix, who writes in 11th century, this slaughter of Jews was done first by the citizens of Cologne. These suddenly fell upon a small band of Jews and severely wounded and killed many. They destroyed the houses and synagogues of the Jews and divided among themselves the very large amount of money. And we have other examples during this period of the Crusades of attacks on Jewish communities. And there's a pictorial representation, again, of the figures that are being, that are kind of pleading for their lives, do have the conical hats, and this is very early lack of perspective of Christian crusaders attacking Jewish communities. And then in the Middle Ages, we have all kinds of other myths going up. The Jews are accused, and we'll get to this, of spreading the plague and ritual murders. They're sorcerers, they're vampires, they're agents of the devil. And this is an interesting early depiction. You can tell they're Jews. You see all the little circles. We have this young Jewish boy sucking on the teats of what was referred to in the Middle Ages as the Jewish sow. Again, playing on the idea that Jewish dietary laws prohibits the eating of pork. So if we really want to get at Jews, we're now going to kind of identify them with ugly, dirty animals, the pig. And there are all kinds of images in around Europe in synagogues and churches today of the Jewish sow. It's another iconic image. And in this case, we have that. And now we have the Jew identified with the devil with the horns. And then that goes into that whole myth that the Jews have horns. And I'll tell you an actual story. My late father enlisted in the US military very patriotically in January of 1943. And was sent down to the South, to Georgia for basic training, and met other young men from across the country. And a very nice guy came up to him one day. He was from either Kansas or Nebraska, and was not at all hostile, just came up to my father in great curiosity and said, Goldberg, I know you're a Jew. I've never met a Jew. Would you mind showing me your horns? Now, I'm surprised knowing my father that he didn't beat him up, but my father was absolutely flabbergasted that there he was in 1943, someone who had the belief that the Jews have horns. This is where it comes from. And it's then perpetuated a little later on. I'm sure you've all seen or may have seen in person or photographs of Michelangelo's great statue of Moses, who has come down from receiving the Ten Commandments. And we know from the actual Hebrew that when Moses got the Ten Commandments, having been in the presence of God, rays of light appeared on his forehead. But in accurate translation, rays of light and horns in Hebrew are very similar words. And so the translation that he got in the Greek into the Italian said that horns appeared on his face, on his head. So we have not only Michelangelo's depiction of Moses, but there are other contemporary accounts of Moses with horns on his head. That just feeds again into the idea of the devil and that Jews have horns. So again, we get these early images that persist. Violence against Jews in the Middle Ages will be organized and spontaneous. We have one belief known as blood libel, that Jews need the fresh blood of a Christian child in religious ceremonies, such as the baking of matzah for Passover. And we have all kinds of examples, particularly in England, but it spreads throughout Europe. This is a depiction of Jews who are basically draining the blood. And we see, here's a Jew, here's a Jewish woman, there's a Jew, they have the circles. This was done, but we see other examples. If you're familiar with the American Jewish writer Bernard Melamed, wrote a book called wonderful novel called The Fixer, which was set in Tsarist Russia in 1906, based on an actual blood libel case that appeared there in the early 20th century. So this persistence that the Jews need the blood of Christian children. Again, probably what happened originally was a child was missing, and therefore, let's point the accusatory finger, and coming up with this idea they needed for their Kabbalistic religious ceremonies, such as the baking of matzah, Passover. And then, of course, when we get to the Black Death, the Jews living in isolated communities down there in Judenstrasse, for whatever reason, they're not getting the Black Death, the bubonic plague, in as large numbers. Well, they live separately. Their interaction with the Christian community is limited, different dietary habits, different burial habits. So we know in Judaism, a Jew dies, must be buried within 24 hours. And so in the Jewish cemetery at the corner of the Jewish section, they're burying them. go down the street at the Christian quarter and the bodies are piling high because they can't bury them. So now we have the people saying, wait a minute, how come they're not getting the plague in the same numbers that we are? Therefore, there must be an explanation. They must be responsible. Again, they didn't know from disease and what really caused the plague. All they knew was that the Jews are not getting the plague, therefore we'll blame them. And that idea that the Jews were responsible, and that manifests itself today. This is a political cartoon from last spring, a stereotypical Jew. That's a very typical late 19th century image. Get your corona shot. By the way, this is before we had the shot, because look who's out to get you. Here's a demonstration a couple of months ago in Ohio. The real plague. Notice what it is. It's a Jew in the form of a rat. Again, if you need an explanation, then suddenly those anti-Semitic images are going to manifest themselves. So it's very much there while we're still here. Very much so. All right, we get back to our Middle Ages. Jews are where they're thriving, where they're needed in an economically important area. They're tolerated, they thrive, they live in their quarter. But suddenly now, if we don't need them anymore, either based on religious reasons or the desire to confiscate their property, Jews are now subject to expulsions from Western Europe. And throughout the late Middle Ages, most of the population moving eastward, particularly to Poland, which topographically is very flat. And likewise, in addition, the Polish kings, and by the way, Poland was the largest country, Poland, Lithuania, in the Middle Ages. The Polish kings said to the Jews, come on, we'll grant you religious freedom. We will allow you to economically develop the land. We'll allow you to settle in your own communities. And so when Jews are expelled from England in 1290, or in France in 1394, or in the German states in the 1300s for the most part, although they will come back, they go eastward into what is today Poland and Belarus and Lithuania and parts of Ukraine. Even after several centuries of religious toleration, the Jews that lived a wonderful existence in Spain, in coexistence with their Muslim brothers, they're expelled finally in 1492 by the Christian monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, and they too will leave. And so this map shows you the expulsion of Jews and where they go. Many of the Portuguese and Spanish Jews will go to the Netherlands, and then because economically it's important there, and ultimately they'll too, and everybody kind of gravitates. If they don't go through the Mediterranean world, they end up in Poland, which explains why you have a very rich Jewish culture developing in later what will be known in Tsarist times as the Pale of Settlement, incorporating, as the map on the left shows you, what is today Poland, into Lithuania, into Belarus, into Ukraine, all the way down to the Crimea. And that's a medieval rendering of Krakow, where you had a very strong Jewish presence. It explains why on the eve of World War II in 1939, the Jewish population of Poland was 15%. Considering that Jewish population in the United States is under 2%, that's a significant statistic, but it's a deceptive statistic because if we dig down a little deeper, the Jewish population of Warsaw was closer to 30%. In Danzig, which is today Gdansk, was 25%. In Krakow, it was more like 25%. In Breslau, which is today Wrocław, 25%. The urban centers of Poland had significant Jewish populations. When you think about it, 30%, almost 1 out of every 3 people living in Warsaw was Jewish, which explains a little bit the Nazi target and the very strong Jewish presence, which also will later explain why the death camps were all built in Poland, because that's where the concentration of Jews were, all going back to this eastward migration because of the expulsions in Western Europe. So it's very, very fascinating when you begin to kind of deconstruct it historically. We get to the 16th century, Martin Luther, renegade Christian monk, has lots of problems with the Roman Catholic Church, and he thinks that maybe the Jews will follow him, that he will offer them a refuge from Christianity, but when they refuse to follow him, he turns virulently against them and publishes a pamphlet in 1543 called Concerning the Jews and Their Lives. And understand, Luther's ideas are able to be spread very rapidly in the 16th century because of the advent of the printing press by the German Gutenberg, and all of Luther's ideas are spread in pamphlets, translated into German, and they're spread all over the place. So therefore, we begin to see now a German version of anti-Semitism based on Luther's strong condemnation of the Jews. What then shall we Christians do with this damned, wretched race of Jews? Their synagogues should be set on fire. Their homes should be broken down. The rabbis must be prevented from teaching. If there's any danger of Jews doing harm to the Gentile overlords, let's drive them out of the country and get rid of them once and for all. So what we find is all of those medieval ideas now get crystallized in a very distinctly Protestant German version, which takes root for the most part in northern Germany. But I think it's important to understand you can have anti-Semitism without Jews, and that's true even today. But a good example of this is when Shakespeare writes The Merchant of Venice in 1600. Shylock, we know, is the Jewish moneylender. He's not the merchant. He demands that his contract for a pound of flesh owed him by a youth who failed to repay a loan be paid in full. A pound of flesh. To the Brits, that's a definite, goes back to that idea of blood libel, that we're going to extract physical payment if you don't do what we want. But the interesting thing that's so fascinating is when Shylock becomes popular in a country, there have been no Jews in England since 1290, 310 years, no Jews, and yet the stereotypical belief and the beliefs in anti-Semitism became embedded in Jewish culture. Shakespeare never met a Jew. He derives his ideas a lot from Europe, but he has never seen a Jew. And although he's not always condemned in the play, if you've read it, but ultimately he has to be punished because he's a Jew and he's forced to convert to Christianity at the end. By the way, that is a very old, that's an early British pictorial image of Shylock. Notice the conical hat, and Venice, they were known to be red. So there we have that typical, very identifiable medieval Jew is wearing that hat. And it was Venice, and that was what they did in Venice. So again, anti-Semitism without Jews. Very interesting. But all is not lost. By the time we get to the late 1700s into the 1800s, we have the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment. Jews now are afforded a lot more rights. The French Revolution and Napoleon. Napoleon writes in 1816 after his defeat, and he's in exile. My primary desire was to liberate the Jews and make them full citizens. I wanted to confer upon them all the legal rights of equality, liberty, and fraternity, as was enjoyed by Catholics and Protestants at the same time. So we have in the 1800s the emancipation of the Jews. Many Western and Central European countries are now going to give the Jews complete freedom. They can leave the ghetto. They can leave the Jewish quarter. They now can go into other phases of European life. And many get assimilated in society. And many Christians naively think that Jews will also give up their religion. But that doesn't happen. Despite the assimilation, many Jews still regard themselves as Jews religiously. They just now happen to believe that they are Germans and French and Italians and Austrians. So what we now find is a different kind of anti-Semitism in the 19th century, more of a political anti-Semitism, because nationalism is growing in the 19th century throughout Europe. And now we begin to see anti-Semitism taking a different point. They're integrated into society, but now they're going to be discriminated against for other reasons. Jews from Poland and Russia, where they continue to be marginalized, now begin to go back into Western Europe, particularly in Germany, Austria, Hungary, and France, where there are opportunities. But now you get these nationalists spreading the idea of a Jewish conspiracy to dominate the world through financial networks. Jews are viewed as unwanted foreigners. Political cartoons sees the Jew as an octopus trying to envelop the world. And now we have all those medieval superstitions and distortions going on. And now, fascinating, the Jews become identifiable with capitalism, but Karl Marx was a Jew, even though his family had converted. And now we begin to see that the Jews get attracted to socialism and communism. So we hate the Jews because they're capitalists, but we also hate them now because they're socialists, which is antithetical. But we're not dealing with logic here. So it's no longer based necessarily on religion, but now we have the Jews seen as a minority group. They don't deserve the same rights. They're succeeding in fields that they had never been involved before, in science, in the arts. And now we begin to see a different kind of discrimination. We don't want Jews living here. We don't want them in this profession. They're not allowed to go to the university. We begin to see quotas coming up because the Jews are excelling in areas that up to that point, they were not allowed to get involved in this. But now that they're liberated in the 19th century, the Jews begin to make their mark in many, many different areas. This is a good example of a very early 19th century political cartoon called Metamorphosis. On your left, you see the Jewish peddler named Moshe Pish. And now in the middle, he's become a clothier named Moritz Wasserstahl. It's been Germanicized. And now in the right, we have Maurice Lafontaine, the art dealer, as he's now metamorphosized into society. But the translation in English is an upstart Jew cannot change his true identity as readily as he changes his clothes and his name. Neither the Enlightenment nor emancipation would confer respectability nor hide his Jewish nose. Again, that visual image of the nose. So again, as Jews make their mark in society, but understand by 1900, German nationalism, as elsewhere, is beginning to grow. And you have a lot of German political parties. Just without going into length, Germany did not really become a nation until 1872. It had been lots and lots of independent states. So they're growing as a country in the very late 19th into the 20th centuries. And so we begin to see the Rothschilds, who have been around since the 18th century, they become really associated with that Jewish network of banking, because Mayer Rothschild, who started in Frankfurt, had branches of his bank in Vienna, in Paris, Naples, and London. The only two branches of the family that really are prominent today are in France and in England. But they're always associated with more modern banking, but by no means were the Jews the only ones in banking. But that, again, to anti-Semites, the Jews controlled the banking industry. And then we get into France in the very late 19th century. France, which always is seen as the democratic country of Europe, the most democratic, because of the French Revolution and so forth. This is a very, very important publication that Edouard Dromont, the director or publisher, was a noted anti-Semite. So this publication always has anti-Semitic articles. And this cover is revealing. We see the stereotypical caricature of the Jewish peddler. And there's money coming out of the pockets and money coming out of his, coins coming out of his feet. But he has a reptilian appearance, claws grabbing at the world. But the nose is there. And basically, the Jews are now trying to take over the world. That is that conspiracy theory that comes out in the late 19th into the 20th century. And it's very important in France because France becomes the most democratic country. The probably most noted example of anti-Semitism in the late 19th century is the Dreyfus case, where based on strong nationalism in Europe, the French have been defeated by the Prussians, then the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War, which led to the unification of Germany and the birth of this very teetering French Republic. Military secrets are clearly being sent to the Germans. It's discovered we've got to find a scapegoat in the military. We have an assimilated Jew by the name of Alfred Dreyfus from Strasbourg, from Alsace-Lorraine. He's the only Jew in the military command, central office. He is the logical scapegoat, even though his handwriting doesn't match all the documentation. The recommendation, the comment is he's forging it. Even when the actual traitor is found, it doesn't matter. He's still found guilty, shipped off to Devil's Island off the coast of South America. And it's not until 1906 that he's totally exonerated. But again, I want to point out the nose on the caricature is not the same nose that actually, we have lots of pictures of Dreyfus. But once again, here he is, again, that reptilian, the traitor. This is from a publication, it's called The Museum of Horrors. There's Dreyfus, and there are lots and lots of images. This completely tore the country apart. Emile Zola, very noted writer, accuses the president of the Republic, J'accuse, and Zola has to flee for his life to Great Britain. Herzl, Austrian Jewish reporter, is at the Dreyfus case, and we know that that becomes the catalyst for Herzl to crystallize his thinking that we're never going to have a homeland, we're never going to find peace here in Europe, and Herzl will now begin to promote the idea of a Jewish homeland. So we see the birth of Zionism, or political Zionism, coming out of the Dreyfus case. That's another whole story that we won't get into. While that's going on in France, going back now to the east into what becomes known as the Pale of Settlement in Tsarist Russia, we have Tsar Nicholas III on the left and his son Alexander III on the left and his son Nicholas II on the right, begin to want to divert attention away from all of the problems that Russia is facing. It is the most, quote, backward country, the greatest poverty. It hasn't been industrialized. It's lagging behind the rest of Europe. It's very straddles Asia and Europe. They've got to divert attention away from all the problems they're facing. What better scapegoat than the Jews? And what we begin to see is the public, although denied, support of attacks on Jewish communities that we know as the Pogroms. And so in that area that becomes known as the Pale of Settlement, we have basically organized attacks led by Cossacks and the Russian army against Jewish communities. This is the period where we all know that thousands upon thousands of Jews from this area decide they've got to leave, forced leaving and volunteer leaving, and this is the big wave of emigration from Eastern Europe into the United States. Remember, this was the most concentrated part of the Jews in Europe because of all those years of migration into what is Poland and what is today Belarus and Ukraine. And so this is a period we know in popular culture of Fiddler on the Roof, and this is the period of the Pogroms going on simultaneously to what was going on in France with the Dreyfus case. And it's in this context that this interesting publication suddenly appears, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. We know in retrospect that it was a forgery, fabrication by the Tsarist police in the 1890s. They are allegedly the minutes of a meeting of World Jewish Conspiracy to take over the world, but becomes translated into many languages. So we have it on the left. There it is in English. In the middle, it's in German. On the right, it's in French. By the way, you could go into a bookstore today in Cairo and get it easily in Arabic. Every now and then, it will resurface because it's kind of seen as the text of anti-Semitism. We know it's a total fabrication, but it's out there. You can probably get a copy of it easily on the internet as well. So again, this comes out of this period into the 20th century. But adding the last dimension to all of this is racial anti-Semitism. So in 1859 or 58, Charles Darwin publishes The Origin of the Species, in which he postulates his ideas of evolution. But his ideas of evolution get completely distorted and misused by those who create what we might call social Darwinism, or very often it's the field of eugenics, which is what I would call a pseudoscience that says that ethnic and racial traits are passed through genes. It's built on the idea that there are distinct races and that these races differ from each other. But what we know from a biological, anthropological perspective, there's only one race, the human race. We're all basically the same, but it's how you take that by saying, look, some people have different pigmentation than others based on all kinds of factors, based on anthropological factors. But when you take it out of the real world of science and put it into pseudoscience, now you take everything else that's been there before, all the religious, all of the economic, all of the political, and now you add a racial component. And what this belief is that hierarchical in nature, some races are higher in development than others. And this was widely used in the 20th century. We see it used in the United States. We see it particularly in the South and during that period of racial discrimination, particularly what we call racial, dealing with black-white discrimination. But now you begin to, if you accept the nationalist notion that Jews are not a religion, but they're also a race. It's in this context that Wilhelm Marr, who we started with, writes his book, The Way to Victory of Germanicism Over Judaism. And one of his colleagues is an Englishman by the name of Hudson Stewart Chamberlain, who happened to marry the daughter of the prominent German composer, Richard Wagner, and all of those amazing heavy operas that promote German nationalism. And so we know the Nazis' favorite composer was Wagner. But Chamberlain, in his writings, comes up with the idea that physically and mentally, the Aryans, who are an ancient people living in North India, are preeminent among all the peoples, and for that reason, they are by right the lords of the world. And so we have this concept of Aryanism. It's a fictional thing. The idea that the people of Northern Europe, the Germans, the Swedes, the Danes, the Dutch, they are pure. Those blonde-haired, blue-eyed, stereotypical image of the Aryan, they are the pure people. And of course, when I taught this, kids would always say, well, Hitler didn't look like that. But that didn't mean that that wasn't the goal. We see this later on, this idea of racial in Nazi propaganda. On the left, we see the Aryan nose and the Jewish nose of a boy, and likewise the girl. And in the middle, from a children's book, we see the Jewish boy, the German boy standing at the blackboard. And the teacher says, the Jewish nose is bent. It looks like the number 6. This idea that there is a physical distinction between Jews and non-Jews. We know, going into the 20th century, that under the Tsar, the Jews were restricted, as I've mentioned, to live in this area called the Pale of Settlement and suffered pogroms, but they get very attracted to the revolutionary changes within the Russian Empire, very attracted to, many Jews are attracted to socialism. There is Jewish involvement in different phases of the Russian Revolution. We know that Trotsky was a Jew. Leon Trotsky was his name. We therefore know, even though there's a little less involvement in the radical phase than the moderate phase, there is Jewish association. This is a march through the streets of St. Petersburg in 1917 by Jewish groups. There is an attraction, and we see this coming into the United States as well, particularly why Jews get very much involved in the labor movement in the United States, because there is that socialist bent. Now we get to World War I. We know that Germany loses World War I. This is an Austrian postcard from after the war that's translated, "Who stabbed the German army in the back?" It's a very fascinating image. We have clearly the Jew, but wait a minute. What's he, she wearing? Well, what they've cleverly done here is they've taken the French iconic image of Lady Liberty. Because if you look at images from France, going back to the French Revolution, Lady Liberty is the iconic image of France. And so now we've associated the Jews with democracy, and we merge them now. And this idea that the Jews have stabbed the Germans in the back, and this infant republic that's born is now going to be held accountable for German defeat in World War One, and there were Jews, and Jews are in very prominent positions in the Weimar Republic, but not all. But now we get this image. By the way, we should point out, tens of thousands of German Jews served the Kaiser in World War I. This is a celebration of commemoration of Hanukkah in 1916 on the Western Front. And of course, this is what's going to become very, very problematic for a lot of Jews as the Nazi period unfolds, because wait a minute, we're not, we're Germans of Jewish background. We're loyal, not German nationalists, but not if you believe that Judaism is a race. And therefore, you may have gotten this gentleman on the right, received the Iron Cross for service. It didn't matter once we get into that nationalistic belief. So when Hitler gets power or starts crafting his ideas in Mein Kampf in 1925 while he's imprisoned, we begin to see the coalescence of all of these themes that we've looked at, from finance to democracy to Marxism. The Jews are parasites, liars, dirty, crafty, sly, wily, clever, without true character. All of these epithets appear in the rantings of Hitler in Mein Kampf. But I want to then kind of conclude a little bit with the idea of the swastika. How does the swastika become the symbol of hate? Because here's the original image. It was a Sanskrit symbol meaning good luck, prosperity, and happiness. How does it become the twisted cross associated with Nazism? So I'm going to show you very quickly some early images of the swastika, particularly as it appeared in the United States or elsewhere. Here it is in, you see it on this ancient Sanskrit depiction. Here it is in a Greek vase. Here it is on a Buddhist statue. And it doesn't matter whether it's in one direction or another. Here it is in Cambodia. And this happens to be a modern building, but they use this old image of that. Here it is in a manhole cover in Japan today. Here it is in Navajo art, because taking kind of a Jungian approach becomes an archetype. Here it is, it's silver in turquoise. Here is the basketball team of a Navajo reservation in Arizona in the 1920s with the swastika. It's good luck. How about the Boy Scouts of America? Images here. The sign of gratitude. This is the publication of the Girl Scouts of America, or it was called the Girls Club. Their monthly publication was called the Swastika. Okay? Drink Coca-Cola. This was one of the earliest symbols of when Coca-Cola appeared in bottles, and you could buy this. It was a little amulet. How about these greeting cards? Greetings sincere with all good wishes on your birthday, with the swastika, with beautiful flowers. In ancient days, swastikas possessed a modern charm and shielded its possessor from danger. Good wishes. Here are all around the world, including, I'll point out to you in the bottom right, in ancient Israeli mosaics, the swastika. It appeared all over the place. How did it get to Germany? Heinrich Schliemann, German entrepreneur, fascinated as a child with the stories of the Aeneid and the Iliad, of the lost city of Troy, finances an archaeological expedition to find the city of Troy in what is today Turkey. And when they're digging down and they find it, they unveil, or they come upon, all this pottery with the images of the swastika. And he brings it home to Germany, where it gets adopted by one of these nationalist parties that evolves into the Nazi party. And so suddenly that symbol of longevity and prosperity gets affixed to the party that becomes the symbol of hate. Didn't start out that way. And I mention that because there were a lot of symbols today that they're innocent in and of themselves until they get that association. And so suddenly there we have the Nazi flags. This is in Nuremberg at the Nazi parade grounds. And there we have it, a kind of Busby, Berkeley's, Ziegfeld Follies kind of formation of that as well. and we even use it now. Deliver us from evil. This was U.S. war bonds, and the symbol of Nazism, the symbol of hate, didn't start out that way. Of course, just to quickly wrap up, we get into the period of the Holocaust, or the precursor to the Holocaust. We have the boycott of Jewish businesses when Hitler takes over. We have the Nuremberg laws that will re-emphasize that, if you look at the back, the Nuremberg laws are unique in classifying Jews not as a culture, religion, but as a race. That meant even non-practicing Jews, or Jews who had converted to Christianity, could be defined as Jews. And we have all of these laws that will exclude Jews, but they all come back to this very important genealogical chart that shows you on the left, pure German, on the right, pure Jew, and all of those mixtures in between, that you could have one Jewish grandparent. You were known in German as a Mischling. And even though we weren't going to touch the Mischlings from the Nazi point of view in the beginning, eventually even they would be not protected. So we're going to start out. Everybody was classified. And if you had a taint of Jewish blood, that meant in one way or another, you were Jewish. And the Jews, therefore, were forced to wear the Jewish star. We mentioned that before, wearing that label. Kristallnacht becomes the ultimate pogrom in a sense. And we have, therefore, the beginning of the Holocaust at that point. We don't have to go any further. But just to point out, in the United States, Henry Ford, by the way, and that's his newspaper on the far right, Henry Ford was the one who brought the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to the United States. It was published as a supplement to the Dearborn Independent, which had a circulation of about 600,000 people. Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy, avowed anti-Semite. Here he is awarded by Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, a high honor in Germany. Down on the lower right is Father Coughlin, out of Detroit, had a very vitriolic anti-Semitic public news broadcast, and probably the most insidious in many respects was Breckinridge Long, who was a diplomat in Europe, served Roosevelt. We won't get into that whole aspect, but I didn't want you to think that America was not part of this at this particular period of time, going into the period of the war. And there are all kinds of things. That's another presentation about why didn't the United States do more to bring Jews in during the period of the 1930s. But a lot of it stems from these gentlemen who are right here. More contemporary images, of course. The Unite the Right white supremacists in neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville 3 years ago, almost 3.5 years ago. Tombstones in the United States and Europe. A year ago in Sweden and Denmark, places we don't necessarily think of with large Jewish populations, desecration of cemeteries. And of course, down in the lower right, the most serious attack on Jews in American history, the Tree of Life shooting in the synagogue in Pittsburgh. Just to wrap it up, finally, these are the statistics. ADL keeps data. And all right, for the first time, and this is in 2017, first time since 2010, there was an anti-Semitic incident in every single state in the United States. And these are reported incidents. And not surprisingly, where there were larger concentrations of Jews, such as New York and California and Florida, Pennsylvania and Georgia, you do have larger incidents. But when you look over in the bottom left, Jews constitute a very small percentage in the United States. You know, when there are the countries, and if you look at the drop from United States, and the third largest country in the world is France, which you never think of that, or Canada, United Kingdom, Argentina, Russia, Germany, Australia, Brazil, it's not a large group of people, and yet the number of anti-Semitic incidents, both in the United States and also in the world, have continued to grow. And lastly, just in your neighboring county where I live, in Westchester, just in 2019, there were swastika incidents in area and middle schools, and this is true in Connecticut as well. Probably the best place to find them in a school is, interestingly enough, in boys' bathrooms. They tend to proliferate there more than any place else, or in on walls such as that. Our Garden of Remembrance, which is where our Holocaust memorial is in White Plains. There was a desecration on the eve of Yom Kippur 2 years ago. And in a diner a little over a year ago in Westchester, a gentleman came in to be served. And when he sat down, this is what was on his head. And interestingly enough, he didn't break any law. It's not against the law in the United States to have a swastika. By the way, it's against German law. You may not fly a swastika. You may not have a swastika. It is against German law. That is regarded as a felony in Germany. It is not against the law in the United States. And so that's where we are. And I thank you all for listening. And I would be more than happy. Yes. Yes. I realize.
No, Steve, it's a little late, but I think people are very engaged. So maybe if there's a couple of questions,
if there are a couple of questions,
people could Nancy, put them in the chat, please.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot that, again, you're right. I mean, just what I showed you, the Anti-Defamation League. I don't know what it will take, Marcy, to shift to the different spelling. I think it takes a long time for that to go on. And I'm very surprised, particularly the Holocaust Museum, that they have not pushed a lot more to get the spelling change. To a lot of people, it may be minor, but I think it's endemic of what we have out there in society. And Nancy points out there were protesters this week with anti-circumcision signs and banners. Yeah. Again, that idea of circumcision being, and that's a whole complicated thing. But again, thank you very, very, very much.
Steve, I recorded the presentation, so if it's okay with you, 2 people have already emailed me that they'd like to receive it.
Absolutely.
So if anybody else wants to, you have my email, so please let me know. And I believe both the Historical Society and Federation will post it on their websites for future reference. And then throughout watching it, you'll be able to see the slides.
Right. And then just addressing Kathleen Cantwell's comment, I think that it's very important. We have to make a difference. And I mean, I don't want to point any accusatory fingers at those people who changed American history at the Capitol this week, but I would not at all be surprised that among that group, you have people who are avowed anti-Semites. I mean, remember, a lot of those people were the same people who appeared in Charlottesville, Virginia. And for many of us, that's the catalytic event. That is the catalytic event. Everything changed because of Charlottesville. And because suddenly it was given a lot more national and international attention. And we could go on with all the examples that continually perpetuate around the world. And then another interesting little side note is the anti-Muslim, which is very referred to as Islamophobia, very often, particularly in Europe, will trigger anti-Semitism, because if we're going to hate one group, then all the other groups that we don't trust get connected. Although the irony there is, in terms of Muslim-Jewish relations, it gets complicated. But a lot of what would happen in Europe in more recent years became a byproduct of the anti-Muslim movement because of the migration from the Middle East into Europe. Suddenly, at that same time, there was a large rash of anti-Semitism as well.
Steve, on behalf of you did actually have one question that I thought was, other than everybody thanking you.
Change its laws. I think that, Joan, that's very interesting. And I think a lot of it gets tied to what we'll be reading in the papers today. And now with the change in who's controlling the Congress, we may see certain topics that might not have been allowed to get onto the Senate floor may suddenly get on the Senate floor. And I'm not saying necessarily because Schumer is Jewish, but because I think there are certain topics related to human rights, related to more liberal causes that might now get more public prominence because of the change in the leadership. And I have my own theories about what's going to happen there also, because I also believe that moderate Republicans who have been stymied because of what happened will now also have a greater voice in their ability to promote a more moderate Republican agenda, because I don't believe that one size doesn't fit all. There are conservative Democrats, there are moderate Republicans. And so I think that we may find that moderate voice in Congress may be exactly what we need to promote better scrutiny of what's happening, because it's not just obviously anti-Semitism, but all of the antis get all connected. Whether it's homophobia, racism, and all of that, we're all lumped in it together, because basically, and I've done this in another presentation, an injury against one is an injury against all. We can't simply say, well, the target is this group. No, it's not this group, it's that group and that group. And we've got to understand the commonality of why are these people targeted, because they are perceived as being different. So I don't want to proselytize any longer than that.
I want to thank you, Steve. You have a ton of thanks in the chat going. I echo that. It was a pleasure to hear from you, although not very, I would say a little bit sobering. Thank you to the Historical Society for their partnership, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Lisa, we need to talk.
Thank you.
I'll get to you soon.
Bye-bye,
Have a great day,
everyone.
everybody.